Okay, students, for today's Dewey-ing history debate, we're going to be talking about regulating the marketplace. Before we do that, we're going to start with this question-focused document. This was a cartoon that was made in 1904 by Joseph Udo J. Kepler, titled Next. Try and think about what you see happening here. I'll tell you that Standard Oil is the name of a company that manufactured refined oil. What's happening in this cartoon? What is the company doing? How might that be similar to a concern some people have about large companies today? Don't forget to generate your own question about the document. For this assignment, there's going to be a couple terms that we need to understand so we can really do the work well. So what is a marketplace? A marketplace is an economic system through which different companies compete with each other and sell their products. So imagine you go to a farmer's market. At the farmer's market, there are a number of different farmers selling tomatoes. Because there's multiple farmers selling tomatoes, they all have to keep their prices competitive. The important part of a marketplace is that there's companies competing. Trust, we need to look at the third definition. It's a group of companies that work together to try to control an industry by reducing competition. So if we just learned about a marketplace, which is a place where there is competition, and that competition kept prices competitive, what's going to happen if companies get together, work together to reduce competition? If the competition is what kept prices low, what's going to happen if we reduce competition? And then we need to know what a monopoly is, not the game. A monopoly is the complete control of an entire supply of goods or of a service in a certain area or market. Example, the company has gained a monopoly on the logging industry in this area. Be a large company that has a monopoly. I have this picture to help you understand what a monopoly is. So if we had one large oil company that buys out all of the 4 independent oil refineries, this company is going to have a monopoly. If they're the only one that's producing oil, they don't have any competition. They have a monopoly. What does that allow them to do to prices of oil? Now we need to talk about what a marketplace policy of laissez faire means. Excuse my pronunciation. My French is not super great. What we're trying to find out is the first definition and how we can use that to describe how the government treats businesses if they follow a laissez faire approach to regulation. Laissez faire means a policy that allows businesses to operate with very little interference from the government. So, how do they feel about regulation? If they don't want to interfere with the business, does that mean they are allowing businesses to do more or less what the businesses want to do? If they're not going to step in and regulate? So, if the government typically regulates the marketplace by interfering with things businesses are trying to do, a laissez faire approach is going to be very little regulation of the marketplace. And our last term is social Darwinism. We just need to understand what the first paragraph says. Think back before we read this to your study in biology class of Darwinism and Charles Darwin. Social Darwinism is the theory that human groups and races are subject to the same laws of natural selection as Charles Darwin perceived in plants and animals in nature. According to the theory, which was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the weak were diminished and their cultures eliminated, while the strong grew in power and cultural influence over the weak. Social Darwinists held that the life of humans in society was a struggle for existence ruled by survival of the fittest, a phrase proposed by the British philosopher and scientist Herbert Spencer. This phrase right here is really important. You may have heard of this phrase in biology class when your science teacher was talking about finches, birds, or other animals, that the animals most adapted to the environment, the animals that had the best qualities, were the ones that would survive. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people like Herbert Spencer thought that they could apply this to human groups. They thought that some groups of humans were more successful because they were more fit or they were better. Tragically, this idea allowed for, frankly, racist behaviors. That this allowed people to think that they could treat people of other races or cultures as less than their culture because they thought they were not as good, they were not as fit. For our use in this class, at this study, we're going to be using the idea of survival of the fittest as it applied to businesses. Some people believed in social Darwinism as also applying to the marketplace, that the reason companies got larger was because those companies were better. Not that they did anything wrong, they grew in strength because they were better. Okay, so now that you know that a marketplace is the place where businesses compete, and that leads to prices being competitive, and a trust is where businesses combine together to reduce competition, and monopoly is when one company has complete control of an industry. Laissez faire means when the government takes a handoff approach on regulation, they're going to let businesses do what businesses want to do, even if that includes buying up their competition and developing a monopoly. And social Darwinism is the belief that everything above is okay, that we should allow the strongest to continue to grow in strength just because they deserve it. Their success is because they are better. We're going to now talk about contemporary debates related to the marketplace. We're going to talk about something called big tech, but y'all know what big tech is, in experience at least. You've heard of the companies Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Today, some people consider those big tech companies to have monopolies and think that the government should regulate them as such. If you want to read more about those companies, you can do so here. But we're going to listen to this article and try and find out what some people think should be done about these companies.
In All Tech Considered, we're looking at why everyone wants to break up big tech. The Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and state attorneys general from across the country have all begun to investigate the tech giants like Facebook and Google. And with Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren leading the charge, Democratic presidential hopefuls now have to stake out their own positions.
I'm not willing to give up and let a handful of monopolists dominate our economy and our democracy.
I agree with Senator Warren that, in fact, monopolies have to be dealt with. They either have to be broken up or regulated, and that's part of it.
Anybody that does not think that we have a massive crisis in our democracy with the way these tech companies are being used, not just in terms of anti-competitive practices, but also to undermine our democracy.
Okay, so after listening to these three politicians' sound bites, can you tell me what the policy problem is? What have those companies done to their competitors? What was the M word they used to describe the companies? What did they say Amazon, Facebook, and Google have become? In those, what like Tom Sawyer says here, if they've become monopolies, what do they think will fix this problem? What was the title of the article? They either have to be broken up or regulated. So if some people think the problem is that big tech companies have grown too large and have monopolies, their solution is to break them up.
That's Cory Booker, and before him, Tom Steyer. To explain why this has become a leading political issue and what breaking up big tech might even look like, I'm joined now by someone who has spent years thinking about it. Columbia Law professor Tim Wu. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
So I know you've explained this to lawmakers on the Hill already, but I want you to explain it to us now. What do you think the harm is that these companies are creating? Because they do offer free services, so we're not talking about like price gouging. Is this more about, say, elimination of choices?
Yeah, it's the harms that come with monopolization, which is the ability of a company to get away with stuff. So if you take a company like Facebook, facing very little competition, they've been able to decrease the privacy protections that they offer people. If you look at a company like Google, with not much competition in search, they've been raising their advertising rates. So it's less in the old-fashioned price-fixing kind of conspiracy, but more about users having less choice, less places to go, and therefore companies being able to get away with more.
So do you think...
So in this paragraph, we're learning about what problems the size of these companies could pose. Does he make it sound like allowing them to have become monopolies is going to allow them to get away with things that are not very good for our community?
The Facebooks or the Googles, Amazons of the world are actually violating current antitrust law?
It depends on the company and the case, but I think there's enough evidence to look hard at the question. I've spent the most time looking at Facebook. They bought out a lot of their most dangerous rivals in the early 2010s. It's against the law to buy your competitors. Instagram and WhatsApp are two of their competitors they bought. So I think there's at least, probable cause that they've done something. The case against Google is a little more complicated, but some people believe that there's enough there to take a look as well.
Now, Elizabeth Warren, she has said that big tech companies, specifically Amazon, Google, and Facebook, should be broken up. She says Amazon should not own Whole Foods, for example, should not own Zappos, the shoe company. Google should spin off Google Search, things like that. So let me ask you, is breaking up these companies the best approach?
It depends. I think sometimes it is. Returning to Facebook, I think their acquisitions of WhatsApp and Instagram were illegal and anti-competitive. And so if they were asked to spin off those companies, undo the acquisitions, it would be a form of breakup, but one I think that would reintroduce competition. I think breakups or undoing of mergers are actually called for more than we have appreciated in the last few decades. But you don't want to create new problems.
What kind of...
Okay, so what were reasons given by Professor Wu or by the politicians above as to why we should break up these big companies. Consider that in order to complete the left side here. What are their fears about the powers of these big companies? How does that justify breaking them up? Now, for the right side, why some people oppose this, we need to look at these unintended consequences. Why would some people not want to break up the big tech companies?
What kind of problems do you foresee?
In any action, there's unintended consequences. If you imagine, for example, breaking up Apple into three little mini apples, there might be more competition, but it might be that people's phones don't work as well, or they lose whatever magic mojo they had. So you don't want to actually make things worse for people. But that said, I think breakups have the positive effect of rebooting an industry, starting things afresh, and frankly, historically, have often been better for people in the long run than anyone predicted.
That's Tim Wu of Columbia Law School. He's the author of The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age. Thanks very much for joining us today.
A pleasure.
Okay. What did he say in this paragraph? What are these unintended consequences? Things like people's phones not working as well. Some people don't want to break up a company like Apple or Facebook or Google or Amazon because they like those companies. They think those companies serve a good purpose. They're worried if that company is broken up, their services might not be as good anymore. So we have some people who fear these companies have too much power and are getting away with abuses that are bad for our country. And some people want to stay hands off, laissez faire. Remember what that means? Because they don't want to ruin the companies because those companies provide them with something that they like. Whether or not that's a good search engine, a social media platform, or an ability to buy something cheap online. So considering these two different sides, what do you think? Should we break up big tech? Do big tech companies have too much power? Should the government do something to stop them from growing as monopolies? Time for part 2, this research-related past policy case study. Remember that John Dewey said, knowledge of the past is the key to understanding the present. History deals with the past, but this past is the history of the present. I'm going to start something called House Resolution 15,657. Trying to find out what should be the goal of government policies related to the marketplace. We're going to focus on sections 3, 7, and 14, trying to find out what this bill would do, what would make illegal for companies to do. The title of the bill, to supplement existing laws against unlawful restraints and monopolies for other purposes. For this act, antitrust laws includes past antitrust laws, commerce means trade, and person includes corporations. Section 3, that it shall be unlawful for any person engaged in commerce to take actions that lessen competition or create a monopoly in any type of commerce. Remember that unlawful means illegal. So if you're somebody engaged in a business, it's going to become illegal to take actions that lessen competition. So you can't take out your competitors and you can't create a monopoly. These seem like fairly simple things to regulate. So one of the big parts of this bill is going to be to make it illegal for a business to lessen their competition or create a monopoly. That's section 3. Section 7, that no corporation shall acquire stocks in another corporation if it lessens competition or creates a monopoly. If one corporation starts buying the stocks of another corporation and has enough stocks that as shareholders they can make decisions for the other corporation, that's going to lessen competition. In Section 14, if a corporation violates an antitrust law, the directors, officers, or agents of the corporation who authorized, ordered, or did the violation will be deemed a misdemeanor and shall be punished by a fine of not exceeding $5,000 or by imprisonment for not exceeding 1 year, or by both. So what's interesting about Section 14 is we're not going to punish the company. If a oil company gets in trouble for forming a monopoly, we're not going to fine the company. We're going to fine the directors, officers, or agents. We're going to fine or imprison the people in charge of the corporation. You think that might lessen the likelihood that somebody in that corporation would do something wrong if they're going to personally face consequences? Okay, so what's important about this bill is that the government is thinking about not taking a hands-off approach. We're not going to be laissez-faire. If a company does things that lessen competition or create a monopoly, we're going to do something to stop that. We're going to try and prevent monopolies from happening. We're going to try and lead to a competitive marketplace. What would lead to us debating that? To understand what was going on at the time, we really need to focus on someone named John D. Rockefeller. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller creates the Standard Oil Corporation in Ohio. The company made deals with railroad companies, allowing them to ship their goods at a lower rate. Since this led to their goods costing less, they could sell them for less. They drove many competitors out of business and eventually developed a monopoly. Remember that cartoon at the very start of this was an oil tank from Standard Oil? Think back to when we did another assignment about regulating industry. We talked about the trains. The trains had been making deals with Standard Oil. That led to Standard Oil gaining more power. It led to their competitors going out of business or being bought up by Standard Oil, and Standard Oil gains a monopoly. What's a problem with the creation of a monopoly in the oil market? If Standard Oil is the only one selling the oil, who's the one determining the price of that oil? If there's not a competing oil company, what's going to happen to prices? 17 years after that, Senate Bill 1532 to regulate commerce is passed. This was the one that regulated the trains. 20 years after Standard Oil was created, in 1890, a bill to declare unlawful trust and combinations in restraint of trade and production is passed and becomes known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. So way back in 1890, they start regulating monopolies. They try to prevent trust from happening. The question is, was that successful enough? Skip down to 1911. In the Supreme Court case, Standard Oil Company versus New Jersey, the United States, the Supreme Court rules Standard Oil violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and broke up Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. So we have two things going on in U.S. history. We have companies forming monopolies, lessening their competition, gaining control over the market, and then we have the United States government trying to regulate those companies, break up those companies in order to increase competition. Because if you increase competition, you should be able to make sure prices stay competitive. It's time to investigate why some people believe we should regulate the marketplace. We're going to look at this cartoon called The King of Combinations. Scroll to it right here. This is Rockefeller. You can tell by his chain around his neck. How is Rockefeller depicted in this cartoon? It's called The King of Combinations. Rockefeller and his corporation gains a terrific amount of power. So, according to the cartoonist, how is Rockefeller behaving? How much power does Rockefeller have? Is this problematic? If you need more help, you can go to the Library of Congress summary to think a little bit more about it. Question is, how is this related to today's debate over regulating the marketplace? It's not Rockefeller anymore. Who would be right here? Zuckerberg? Bezos? What are the large companies now? Who's in charge of those companies? How much power do they have? Do some people think that a person like Zuckerberg has way too much power? If you would, then you would probably be in favor of regulating that company in order to keep them from having too much power. So if Section 1 is in favor of regulating the monopolies in the marketplace because they think the corporations have become too big and have too much power, we need to find out why some people think we should adopt a laissez faire policy towards the marketplace. We're going to look at a cartoon from Guy R. Spencer. Didn't have a title. Here's a cartoon. To understand this, we're going to look at this quote from John D. Rockefeller's son. John D. Rockefeller's son said, "Business is survival of the fittest." Phrase sound familiar? The American rose can only grow the beauty and fragrance which brings cheer to its owner by killing the early buds growing around it. This is not an evil in business. It is the laws of nature and God. So who is this man here? Is this Rockefeller? What's he doing to this rose bush? You all know what pruning is, right? In order to make this rose bud large and beautiful and fragrant, what do you have to do to the smaller buds? What are they down here? Those aren't roses, but skulls, aren't they? So in order for this company to be better, it has to kill off the competitors. But he doesn't make that sound bad. He makes that sound good. As this company grows bigger, this company grows better. What would happen if we regulated this company? What would happen if we allowed all of these smaller competitors to stay alive? Would this company have become so, I guess you'd say, great? Not aligned with John Rockefeller's son. So according to John Rockefeller's son, it's okay to get rid of competition because that makes what better? How could you apply that to today's debate over big tech? Many people use Amazon or Google or Facebook because they are really good at what they do. If we were to break up those corporations, think back to the article that talked about unintended consequences. What might happen if we regulate the marketplace and break up those monopolies? Would the companies still be as good when they're no longer as big? Is that a reason we should keep our hands off? We should be laissez-faire because we don't want to interfere with something that so many people use and enjoy? Time for our choices and consequences. In 1914, Congress passed the bill and becomes known as the Clayton Act. So, we chose to regulate the monopolies. Why do you think that was? Congress was creating laws to regulate the marketplace because they thought the monopolies were gaining too much power? They must have, if that's what they chose to do. So we begin regulating, or we not begin, because we started back in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act. We continued to regulate monopolies because monopolies had continued to grow in power. Some examples that you might be familiar with the companies instead of Standard Oil, if we were to talk about a company called AT&T, you've heard of them, right? In 1984, there's a Supreme case called United States versus AT&T. As a result of the case, American Telephone and Telegraph was ordered to be broken up into 7 regional Bell operating companies and a much smaller new AT&T. So this was back in the day where your phones used to be attached to the wall. You know AT&T in a little bit of a different context as a cell phone carrier, right? In 2000, the Supreme Court case United States versus Microsoft Corporation results in a court ordering a breakup of Microsoft into 2 separate units, one to produce the operating system and one to produce other software components. Microsoft had grown to too large of a company and had too much power, so the government broke it up. So we have 2 pretty well-known examples here of the government regulating large companies because they thought it was in the country's best interest for these corporations to not grow too large, to not have any competition. This is the evolution of Standard Oil. So remember that in 1911, it was broken up into 34 companies. There was all of these oil companies. But over time, what seemed to have happened to those oil companies? Is there still 34 of them? All these acquisitions happening again. And now we have fewer. As there's fewer corporations in oil, is there less competition? If there's less competition, what happens to prices? Think about it. If we have 2 gas stations instead of oil companies, 2 gas stations across the street, their prices will be reasonable because they'll be in competition. If one gas station raises their price by 50 cents, is anyone going to go there? But if we eliminate that competition, what's going to happen to those gas prices? So in the past, the government has chosen to regulate and break up monopolies because they think that it's bad for those companies to have so much power. The question is, should we do the same today? So what's the similarity? In both times, we're regulating the marketplace. And what's the other M word that you could put in there instead of marketplace? What are we trying to stop companies from doing? Creating a monopoly, right? In the past, what kinds of monopolies were we talking about? What's the monopoly today? So even though there are some differences between an oil company and a big tech company, because these people, such as Google and Facebook and Amazon, aren't actually charging you money in the same way that an oil company is. That's the article talked about that. They still do lessen their competition. If you want to create the policy advice and tell me whether or not we should or should not break up big tech, you'll get extra credit for it on this assignment. Good luck. Let me know if you have questions.